I'd like to talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing and the issues that surround it. And it's difficult sometimes to talk about this work because it raises very, very serious questions about what kind of country we live in, what kind of society we've created, what's happened to our commitment to fairness and equality. The United States is a very different country today than it was 40 years ago. In the last 40 years, something really radical has happened in this country and has changed this country in some very profound ways. The prison population in America in 1972 was 300,000 people. Today it is 2.3 million. And mass incarceration has fundamentally changed this country. Our country has been corrupted by the politics of fear and anger. And our politicians and policymakers have exploited that fear and anger, and we've done some devastating things to lots and lots of people. In many communities, 40, 50, 60% of the young men of color are in jail, in prison, on probation, or parole. We've created laws that have incredible collateral consequences. The Welfare Reform Act of 1996 actually created provisions that allows us to now ban people with drug convictions from public benefits. So during our lifetime, the United States Congress actually created a law that created a new class of person. And it's mostly women with children who are now our untouchables. These women cannot access the public housing, they cannot access food stamps, they can't get public medical services. They are on the margins of our society, legally excluded because of a prior drug crime. We've taken away people's right to vote. My state of Alabama, 34% of the black male population has permanently lost the right to vote. We're projecting in another decade there'll be parts of Alabama where the disenfranchisement among African American men will be actually higher than it was before the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. And still there is this appalling silence. And all of these data, the fact that we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, all of these statistics really haven't changed the way we think about what we're called to do when it comes to justice. And I wanted to talk tonight, reflect a little bit on the dynamics that I think allow us to confront injustice.
I think as a journalist, part of what really spoke to me and part of what I think of a lot is this question of narrative. In my own work, I try very hard to focus on alternative narrative, on humanizing narratives that are about prisons and prisoners. And one place that I've found where you can find sort of unexpected, amazingly alternative narratives are in prisoner publications, like the Angleite or the San Quentin News, which I love to open and read because as tragic as mass incarceration is, there's this incredible life that takes place within these places. You know, even among prisoners who have very little hope of ever getting out. And so, but very few people, the average American isn't reading these publications. So where do you find, what are some ways that we can share those kinds of alternative narratives? Where can sort of people seek them out, and how can we promote them and advance them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that when you go into spaces where people have been neglected, where they've been abandoned, where they're living in the margins of society, you actually find amazing things. And and if you listen, if you go in and you ask questions, if you go in and you just start kind of making pronouncements about this is wrong and unfair, and if you just start talking, then you don't actually hear the narrative that you need to hear. And one of the most powerful things for me for the race and poverty work that we've been doing is we've been just going into the Black Belt, these really poor counties, some of the poorest counties in America, places like Wilcox County where the median household income is $10,000 a year, places where the literacy rate is barely over 50%, places where people are still very much living the lives of sharecroppers and tenant farmers and really, really difficult existences. But we went in and just started asking questions, and when you hear people talk, there is this ability to kind of articulate some of these things. You know, I grew up reading great literature. I read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and I went to a poor community in Pike County, Alabama, to meet the sister of one of my clients on death row. And she lived out in the middle of a field, and she was talking to me, and then finally she said, you know, she said, I feel like we're invisible out here. She said, with this incredibly high infant mortality rate, all these young women have children, they all die. She said, I see my young kids, 12 and 14, getting angrier and angrier and angrier. They have to go to school in the morning. They walk through the fields when it's dark, and there's all this cow manure in the fields, and by the time they get to the end of the road, they've stepped in something and they smell bad. And the kids make fun of them because they smell bad, and then they get into fights, and this anger is growing. And she said, I want somebody to do something. I want somebody to see it, but she said, it's like we're invisible. And her articulation of this concept of invisibility was powerful. And I think what we have to do is to hear those narratives and amplify them, to repeat them, to shed the light on them. And a lot of times it's just being observational. A lot of the work that I'm doing now on racial trauma, the psychic injuries that are connected to racial humiliation, are really sort of related to what I'm remembering that I saw when I was a young kid that I didn't even pay any attention to. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately, when I was a little boy, we didn't have a doctor in our county, but it was time for kids to get polio shots. Like sort of the early 60s, that was something that everybody wanted. And the healthcare workers came to our county and they said everybody had to be at this location at a particular time. And I remember going because things were very segregated, so all the white kids went through the front and the black kids had to line up in the back. And my mother took us back there and we were out there, it was cold. And we stood out there for hours waiting for them to finish giving shots to all the white kids. And then by the time they got to the black kids, the nurse was tired. And the workers were worn out, and they couldn't tell nice jokes. They didn't have any more lollipops. It was just difficult. And I was watching these kids get jabbed by these nurses, and it seemed so intimidating. And all of the parents and family members and the community was there. And my sister was in front of me, and the nurse came and finally got my sister and grabbed her, and my sister was screaming for my mom, and the nurse took the needle and just jabbed her in the arm, and it looked so terrifying to me. I was about 5 or 6 years old, and then they came for me, and I just started screaming, and I was just couldn't understand why this was happening. And then all of a sudden, I heard all this glass breaking, and I turned around, and my mom, who was a church musician, who was sweet, who was kind, who would just take kids in from everywhere, who was always loving and adoring, my mom had walked over to a wall and picked up a tray of beakers and had started throwing them against the wall. And she was slinging stuff all over that place. And the doctor who was there got very upset. He said, call the police, we're going to put her in jail. And the black ministers came and started advocating for her. Said, no, 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 no. And they had to kind of persuade them to keep giving polio shots and to persuade them to not put my mom in prison. And that reflected kind of a narrative of endurance, of what it means to kind of endure this kind of humiliation and trauma. And it's an important narrative because it tells us something about what the struggle really represents. And that's what you hear in a lot of the voices of incarcerated people, a lot of the stories that incarcerated people write about. And it's important that we understand it because there's some real truth in it. Mm-hmm. And truth is always something that we all need.